So if there's one thing we've covered well here on the channel, it's people blaming video games for everything that happens. This has been a pretty common trend over the last few decades whenever, something happens that's traumatizing or negative in any way, really. You have this constant stream of boomers that have no idea what they're talking about, that just blame anything and everything on video games, on music, on television, on movies. Basically just blaming the entertainment industry for things that they had pretty much no involvement in whatsoever. We've done this through series like It's the Video Game's Fault, Not My Bad Parenting, and of course covering other instances where mass tragedies have happened and of course video games were blamed for them. Now tragically, the United States has a pretty severe issue with this kind of thing happening, with these mass tragedies, with these mass casualty events, I think is what they're actually called. Essentially, somebody will get a gun, they'll go into someplace in public and just start shooting at random, killing a bunch of people. We pretty much have hundreds of them per year in this country. We're the only developed country on the planet that has a problem like this, but yet as a developed country, we are unable to come to a conclusion on what causes it. We can't figure it out. We don't come together and actually solve this problem ever. We don't really even talk about it, to be honest. Every time something like this happens, everyone just gives their thoughts and sympathy and everything, and they put a tweet out. Next thing you know, 3 days later when the next one happens, rinse and repeat the cycle. Unfortunately, we're all guilty of it. It's something that we all do, and I think it's because as a country, we're just so desensitized to this kind of thing now, to where it doesn't even mentally affect us like it used to. When this was kind of like a newer issue, a first starting to develop problem, this shocked the country. But of course, this happens pretty much every day now. A school or a movie theater or a grocery store, it doesn't really matter. It could be even your office or your own home. People are victims to these senseless tragedies. And what is the number one scapegoat that people love to come up with that isn't, guns or mental illness? Video games, okay? So Fox News ran a segment the other day where they were talking about some of these mass casualty events. Obviously, we've already covered the one that happened in the Buffalo supermarket, as we had Deadspin trying to basically capitalize off of that for attention. Well, now we have Fox News doing what the mainstream media does best, blaming video games for a problem that, well, video games weren't even involved in the first place. They also were talking about the California church shooting where 5 people were hurt and 1 was killed. They were doing like an interview, I guess, with a local sheriff in this instance, and this is basically what was said. I'm just going to play the full clip in its entirety and we'll talk about it afterward, because there's just so much to talk about here. So go ahead and take a look, and yeah.
I think of, what must go through the minds of these people, like the guy yesterday who's accused of shooting up that supermarket. He's 18 years old. His whole life was in front of him, and now his life essentially is over because of what he decided to do. Do they not think about this before they open fire? Are they so wrapped up in themselves, as you say, so psychopathic, that nothing else matters to them?
You'd have to have a conscience to feel that way. And so, no, there's not. It's a blind obsession. It lacks empathy. Thus, it makes them so incredibly dangerous.
I wonder, it seems like these things have gotten so much worse since video games became so realistic and so violent. Have you done research or, learned that video games tend to just desensitize people to the actual results of pulling a trigger?
I think in terms of causation, what the information shows us is that as we become more disfranchised, as individuals and groups, people leave a faith, for example, the family units become smaller or more disconnected, we live at further distances, and we're communicating through a medium that was never really intended as a human being, which is online or through texting or these kind of things. We get separated as humans to have that connection that builds, I would say, an inner morality. But all of that aside, there's things that we know that if we have areas where we congregate as in groups, we have large retail locations, we have large churches, there's things we can do in anticipation from this anomalous event, which still is rare in the U.S., even though it's increasing. And there's things we can proactively do to protect ourselves and protect our groups from the vulnerability of somebody like today walking into a place of worship.
So first I want to say congratulations to the sheriff for not playing into this stupid fucking question by the host here on Fox News. I don't really agree with what the sheriff said at the end of the day. I feel like he kind of blames the internet for people becoming disenfranchised from society when that's really not the case at all. This was literally just an instance. By the way, with the Buffalo one, from what I've read, this guy had a run-in at school where he made like jokes about coming to school with a gun and killing people, and the police were involved, yet they passed him up. They didn't care. They just basically took him at face value, saying that it was a joke. He later admitted this was not a joke. And the red flag law, which is a law in New York where somebody who's basically been like showing signs or history of being violent and aggressive, they can't purchase a gun, right? He was not flagged for the red flag law, meaning he was able to basically acquire a firearm the same way that anyone who, you know, isn't making threats to kill a bunch of people could. So I think that that's partially responsible for this whole thing happening. Mental illness, obviously, I think is a pretty big factor in the whole thing too. At the end of the day, it's pretty apparent through all of the science and through common sense even that video games are not responsible for this kind of shit happening. So we'll start the whole defense of this whole thing off with a pretty good situation here to bring up because it kind of defeats everything that they say. So the host kind of like insinuates that this problem is getting worse because video games are becoming more realistic. You know, the violence is more realistic. It desensitizes people to real violence or whatever, right? I guess. So I just wanted to bring up a pretty good example of this kind of thing happening before video games or the internet or any of this even really existed. So one of the first widely known of mass shootings in American history happened on September 6th of 1949 when a 28-year-old World War II veteran shot 16 people in his neighborhood with a semi-automatic pistol, killing 13 of them. The youngest one was a 2-year-old and the oldest was 68 years old. Obviously, video games did not exist at this time. I don't even know if they had color TV at this point. So I don't know how we blame video games as a society for a problem that has existed well before the advent of video games or realistically even the technology for video games to exist. People were killing each other and committing mass killings and all kinds of crazy shit way before video games. I mean, you look at people like Jack the Ripper, you know, he wasn't around when video games existed, yet this fucking lunatic still went around and became a serial killer, you know what I mean? So if video games are what's accelerating this trend of just mass killings and just carnage and bloodshed, why was this still so prevalent in human nature before all this happened, right? Before the invention of video games and other things like this. It's because common sense will tell you that video games aren't at fucking fault. I mean, you look at more notable shootings like Columbine, which happened I think in like 1999. Video games weren't realistic then. They were still basically 3D polygons on a screen, if that, really. So what's the argument here? Because there's more shootings now, that's because all video games have gotten more realistic? By the way, this ignores all of the science that's already been done on this subject. We've gone over this multiple times before, but there's already been science done on this. They've already studied this. There's been countless amount of taxpayer dollars, of private funding dollars that have gone towards seeing if video games really do desensitize people, if they lead to real life violence, if they make people more aggressive. And time after time, countless times, the science has come back unanimously to say that video games are not responsible for leading people to be desensitized to real life violence. It doesn't lead to people becoming more aggressive. It doesn't lead to people being desensitized to murder. It doesn't make it easier for them to kill anybody. We've already done the research on this topic, and the research does not support what's being said. But yet, constantly, you'll have these boomers come out, and the first thing they blame is video games whenever anything like this happens. Now, to a certain extent, can you blame them? They don't understand video games. Obviously, older generations are a little bit less likely to play video games in the first place. It just, you know, the technology came out when they were in their 40s and whatnot, so these people just, they never really got on board, right? But that doesn't excuse you from being fucking ignorant and saying stupid things like this and turning the conversation away from what it should be, which in my opinion is a very dangerous precedent, and it serves zero purpose other than to just scapegoat something that doesn't, you know, have any involvement. As a pro-Second Amendment person myself, I find it incredible that people will make arguments like, oh, it's not the gun's fault that something like this happened because it's an inanimate object, you know, it needs somebody to operate it. It doesn't just go around and kill people by itself. But the same people who say shit like that are the same fucking people who will say that an inanimate Xbox 360 is what desensitized your child to murder. Have we as a society ever considered that maybe the reason we're all so fucking desensitized to violence is because in the entire history of our country we've had like 50 years of peacetime where we weren't at fucking war? Or maybe because literally every single day there's a new mass shooting that happens where fucking 8 people get killed? Have you ever considered that maybe your kids became desensitized to violence because in school they have to fucking duck under their desk and hide in an active shooter drill? Which, by the way, we're the only country on the planet that even has to fucking worry about doing that in schools. Woohoo! Go America, right? So, if everything I've said so far hasn't been enough to convince you of the fact that video games have no involvement in this, go ahead and take a look at this infographic. Now, this comes from Vox, which is a source I typically do not support, but they actually cited their sources on this infographic, so I'm still going to go ahead and show it. What you're taking a look at is the top countries by video game revenue in 2019 per person. Obviously, the United States is third on this list. We're not even the top video game consumers on the planet, yet we have exponentially more violent gun deaths, which is weird because if video games were actually responsible for desensitizing people and leading to this kind of violent death, you would think that the graph on the right looks a lot like the graph on the left, where the more that people spend money on video games, the more likely they are to die to violent gun deaths. But in fact, the opposite is true. The top 2 countries have 2 of the lowest recorded violent gun deaths per capita in the entire world, by the way. And then every other country besides the United States is exponentially lower regardless if they're higher than the other countries or not. It's incredible, you know, because once again, right, like video games are causing this violence, right? They're causing so much of this violence. We need to do something about it, but yet, you know, you look at basic information like this, and you can clearly see that this is just ridiculous because the science, the numbers, the data, none of it lines up with what these people say. So why do they continue to say it? Why do video games continue to be a scapegoat for violent things happening in real life? I don't know. Could it be the gun manufacturers lobbying in Congress and purposefully spreading misinformation to try and get people to believe that, you know, or at least to take the blame off of them? Because a lot of people do blame gun manufacturers and stuff when this happens. There's like a decent amount of support for making them legally liable for these kinds of shootings and stuff, which, I mean, I think that that's very debatable in court. But is it them trying to deflect blame? Is it Fox News trying to deflect blame? If you didn't know, recently Fox News actually came under a lot of fire and they were considered actually a scapegoat because a lot of the white supremacist ideals that the Buffalo shooter actually espoused in his manifesto were ones that were commonly spread using Fox News by people like Tucker Carlson. And you had people blaming Tucker Carlson and Fox News for the shooting because, you know, they were espousing these beliefs that the shooter had. They were influencing people to believe these kinds of things, right? But then now all of a sudden they want to blame video games. They're trying to spin the blame off onto someone else. To me, this is Fox News just trying to find a scapegoat for whatever that they can because they don't want to be found liable for what happened. Personally, I think the person we should be blaming for this whole thing is the person who does it in the first place. I think they definitely hold the shoulder of blame, the vast majority of it. Sure, there's other circumstances at fault and they need to be talked about and discussed, but it's not video games, okay? It's not movies, it's not television, it's not music, it's not books, it's not video games. We need to, as a country, stop blaming entertainment for the shit that's going on because every other country in the world consumes the entertainment we consume on even bigger bases like we just looked at, and yet they do not have this fucking problem. So can we please shut up about this and actually start talking about the real issues? With that being said, thank you for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're brand new around here on the channel, follow me over on Twitter and Twitch at @SubToOptimus. Make sure to check out Shoptimus down below. And until my next video, guys, this is Optimus, well, calling out Fox News for this bullshit take, and signing out.